Okay, I'd like to go ahead and welcome everyone who's joining us today. My name's Kelly Graham with University Conference Services. We're thrilled to have you joining us today online for this webinar, Emerging from Crisis, 10 Actions for Pension Plan Sponsors. We're thrilled to have Joe Anzalone and Michael Clark from River and Mercantile Solutions going through this information with us today and sharing their immense knowledge. I've got just a couple of housekeeping items to start with. First, for the best audio, we do recommend listening to the webinar over your computer speakers. If you're having difficulty, the phone number to call in and listen through the phone is located right there at the top of the Q&A pane. That Q&A pane is there for participants to send their questions in to Joe and Michael. Your questions are private, so other attendees won't be able to see what you send in, but Joe and Michael will get to as many of your questions as they can during the presentation, and if we run out of time today, they will follow up after the fact. Today's session is being recorded, so you can check your email tomorrow. Everyone who participates in the complete live webinar will receive a link to the recording and all the continuing education credit information tomorrow. We are offering credit for through HRCI, SHRM, and CPE credit for CPAs and advisory services. And so with that, I will turn the mic over to Joe and Michael. Thank you both again for being here, and I'll let you get started.
All right, thank you, Kelly. This is Michael Clark. I want to thank Kelly and the rest of the UCS staff for hosting us today and being able to put on these programs even while most of us are still in a stay-at-home order and working remotely. So we appreciate the opportunity to still be able to talk with this group and give you our thoughts on things that pension plan sponsors should be doing coming out of this current crisis. We also want to thank each of you for joining us. We hope you're doing well and that you're staying safe, and that hopefully in the near future things will start to get back to what we're going to call a new normal. For those of you that maybe aren't as familiar with River and Mercantile, just a quick 2 seconds on our firm. We're a global consulting firm with 4 main lines of business: actuarial and investment consulting, OCIO, derivative solutions, and asset management. And each of those lines of business influences the others in how we think about our clients and how we tailor solutions for their needs. So that's just a little bit about the firm and where we're coming from that will give you a sense for some of our background and the things that we do. Kelly already introduced us, but you can see our pictures up there on the screen along with some of our credentials. I will admit that both Joe and I maybe have a little bit of a corona beard going on right now and are not as clean shaven as these pictures would imply. But our contact information is there, so if we don't get to your question today, or if you've got follow-up questions that you think of after the fact, feel free to reach out to either one of us. We'd be happy to field those questions. And really what we hope you get out of today's webinar is some concrete action items to address with your teams so that coming out of this current pandemic crisis, you'll be well positioned to manage your pension plan and take advantage of some opportunities, but also take it as an opportunity to reassess some of your setup. And we'll talk through a number of those items today. All right, so first, how is this current pandemic going to change things? I'm sure, like most of you, there's a lot of information out there. We've actually been reading a lot of it ourselves about expectations on things that will change in a post-COVID-19 world. Here were 4 that we pulled out that we've seen regularly commented on. The first one being telecommuting and virtual meetings like this. We think they're going to become more common. When you think about that from a retirement plan perspective, right, that means thinking about participant interactions, how you get business done, all of those different things are going to be impacted by more and more people working in a virtual remote world, right? The next thing was around telehealth gaining traction. I think this is indicative of services that used to be primarily in person are now going to be able to be received virtually. As an example, I actually had two of my sons had an appointment with a doctor that we actually did over a video conference. It was a first-time consultation for some issues that they were experiencing, and it was really interesting to go through that process and have that appointment and have the doctor actually then formulate a plan for the next steps that they need to go through. But again, I think this is indicative that services in general that used to be primarily only in person are now you're going to see some of those move to more of a virtual setting. Social distancing is here to stay in some form or fashion, right? I mean, I think we've all seen that in terms of plans that airlines have thrown out there for maintaining social distancing on airplanes. But you think about it from an employee perspective and a participant perspective in particular, a lot of the requirements I think we will see change that used to require people to be in person for things. So a prime example that we've already seen come out over the last few weeks is around notary requirements, right? And electronic documents. So people being able to have an electronic notary signature on something to have that type of documentation obviously becomes very important for pension plan participants that are wanting to start their pension payments and have to fill out those distribution election forms and might maybe have to have spousal consent that requires a notary signature. And then finally, risk mitigation is going to gain momentum, and it always does coming out of any kind of crisis that wreaks havoc on markets especially. Crisis will always bring risk mitigation to the forefront. And really, what you'll see from our discussion today is that it's very important, in fact, imperative, I would say, for pension plan sponsors to address this particular aspect coming out of the current pandemic, to be prepared for whatever the next big disruption is, because we don't know when or how big, but we know they come. So being prepared for that, we think is going to be imperative for most people, not only from their pension plan side of things, but their overall business. All right, so what about retirement plans in particular, right? Over the last few months, we've seen sharp declines in funded status for many pension plans. That is going to have implications down the road for plan sponsors as it relates to balance sheet and income statement effects, contribution concerns both in the short and long term, and overall rising costs. The more underfunded a pension plan is, the more expensive it is to maintain in a lot of different facets, right? The other thing that I think that this particular situation that we're in today has really brought to the forefront is challenging the ability to administer a plan correctly. And we'll talk a lot about that today. Joe will go through some items around systems and procedures that are worth taking a look at. And tangential to this, and we're not going to focus a lot on defined contribution plans except for where it makes sense. And given the current pandemic, we've obviously, participants, especially in 401k or 403b, 457 plans, have seen sharp declines in their account balances as well. On top of that, we're seeing companies, as a matter of trying to control some of their cash constraints, actually turning off their matching contributions. Long term, well, even short and medium term, we can see how this will make it difficult for some older workers to effectively retire, right? And we've seen this in past crises as well, where you get these significant drops in someone's retirement account balance, and all of a sudden, when they were expecting to retire maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, maybe that gets pushed out another 2 or 3 years to allow them to catch up where they needed to be from an account balance standpoint to effectively retire. So with that as a backdrop, Kelly, I'll have you put up our first polling question. We'd love to get some input and thoughts on this from the audience. You can select the option that you think best applies to your situation. But the question here is, what is your biggest concern with respect to your pension plan coming out of the pandemic crisis? We'll give you a couple of seconds here to cast your vote. And not surprisingly, based on some of these early responses, funded status is going to be a primary concern for a lot of organizations. And closely tied to that is the investment decisions behind those. that obviously affects a lot of different things from a business operationally in terms of the financials, what's happening with the balance sheet and income statement, as well as those contribution requirements, which we think will be top of mind for a lot of plan sponsors. And regardless of what type of plan you're involved with, whether it's a corporate pension plan, a public sector pension plan, or even a multi-employer plan. So kind of, I think these are great results that really highlight where we see the biggest concerns right now. And we'll do our best to address some of these around funded status and especially the ability to administer the plan, investment decisions, and good governance. We'll tackle all of those as we go through today. All right, moving on from the poll. So we're going to talk about, like I mentioned, the 10 action items that we think you should be doing now to make sure that you're well positioned coming out of this crisis to deal with things now and to set yourself up for success in the future. And I mentioned we'll talk about strategy and risk management. That's primarily tied to funded status, plan administration, governance, and investments. If we've got time at the end, we've got a bonus discussion that we'll throw out there as well, just around some philosophical ideas around retirement program design. So jumping into these 10 action items, the first one is around evaluating your goals and objectives. We've got the Cheshire Cat pictured here from Alice in Wonderland with the paraphrased quote, if you don't know where you're going, it really doesn't matter the road you take, does it? If you don't know what you're trying to achieve with your pension plan in the short, medium, and long term, it really doesn't matter what actions you take at the end of the day. But from a governance standpoint, from a just overall retirement program design, we think that this is an ideal time for plan sponsors to take a step back, ask themselves what they are trying to achieve, and then make sure that they've got strategies in place for actually being able to achieve those down the road. So what does that actually look like? What conclusions could you come to, or objectives, goals that you might set for your plan? We've listed several here. I'll walk through these individually. The first one is around controlled risk-taking. And what we mean by that is understanding how the pension plan fits into your overall organization, right? And what type of risk it poses to the organization. So if we end up in a situation like we've seen the last couple of months, what does that do to the business, right? And realizing there's a lot of other mitigating factors, but at the same time, being able to assess how much risk the pension plan in and of itself could put on the organization as far as strain. The next thing, asset growth. If you think about this, especially from a public sector pension plan viewpoint, you generally have a target asset return that you're trying to achieve. That actually gives you something that you can measure and monitor over time and assess how well you're doing, how well your providers are doing. But if you've got a target that you're trying to achieve there to keep up with your liabilities or outperform your liability growth over time, having some goal around that target asset growth will be important. Sustainability could be another outcome that an organization might look to as their end goal. That might involve a target funded status level and a funded status risk level that ensures that the organization can continue to maintain their plan in its current form into the future. So it would prevent you from perhaps having to make adjustments to the benefit formula and reducing benefits prospectively, or even freezing the plan or terminating it altogether. These last two items, more applicable to the corporate pension plan landscape than anything, but with hibernation, what we're talking about is getting to a point of being fully funded and then removing as much funded status risk as possible so that the plan really is on autopilot and doesn't raise any cause for concern that could result in benefit changes or a shift away from the plan altogether. And then finally, termination. For frozen corporate DB plans, that's going to involve specifying a time horizon where you actually want to take that plan and offload it from the organization altogether. Maybe it's a strain on resources internally and a distraction for most for a benefit that maybe isn't providing much incentive for your current workforce. So there's some good reasons why a company would want to consider termination. So once you've articulated what a successful outcome looks like, then you need to actually start understanding what risks that plan in its current state pose to the organization. And the risk that we're talking about here is really funded status risk. It's how much the funded status of your plan could change over any given period of time as markets change and the like. So it's really the likelihood of an adverse change in funded status that will materially affect contributions or other financial measurements within your organization. So what we've shown here as an example, we've looked at some impacts, some effects in isolation here. Just to understand these bars, if we look at just the first two groups of bars, the interest rates changing by 1%. The gold bars represent the change in the asset amount for a rise or a fall in interest rates. The blue bars represent the impact on liabilities, and the resulting gray bar is the difference between those two. So we can see how funded status is actually changing. What you can see is that and this is really applicable and important to corporate pension plans given the way their liabilities are valued, is that changes in interest rates can have a dramatic effect on the resulting funded status. The next two columns here related to credit spreads rising and falling, again, more appropriate or applicable to corporate liabilities given the way that they're valued based on high-quality corporate bond yields. So understanding how that relates to Treasury yields and how that could actually affect your funded status is another important metric to look at. And then finally, equity markets. So what happens when equity markets rise or fall? You can see there's a direct one-to-one. If assets go down by call it $10 million, your funded status is going to decrease most likely by $10 million, all else equal, right? Now, what's interesting about these is that we actually have seen some of these scenarios play out in Q1, especially the equity markets falling this year. But we know that in reality these things don't actually occur in isolation. It's just to help you get a sense for what the biggest drivers to funded status could be. But as an example, in 2019, we more or less saw a situation where interest rates fell by 1% and equity markets were up over 20%, so some sort of combination of those two. Whereas in the first quarter of this year, we saw interest rates continue to fall, but then equity markets fall as well. So you can see that compounding effect that when you start putting these different scenarios together, what it looks like for potential changes in funded status. So the other thing that we suggest that plan sponsors look at is really a projection of their funded status over the short and medium term, run through a bunch of different economic scenarios so they can understand at the end of the day the range of potential funded status outcomes that they could be dealing with. This goes back to really understanding and coming to terms with the risk that's in your plan. So if we look at this particular chart, what we've done is through 1,000 different economic scenarios, we've graphed this plan's funded status. If you look at the solid lines, that represents, they're based on a current asset allocation, the current state of the plan. That range of potential funded status outcomes at the end of a 5-year period is fairly wide. And when we talk about managing your risk, we're talking about taking those lines and making them look more like the dotted lines potentially and bringing that range of funded status outcomes in to a level that as an organization you're comfortable and willing to bear, right? So that if you ended up in part of the downward end of this funded status range, that you'd say as an organization it's not ideal, but we can bear that, we can stomach that. So with that, Kelly, let's go to our next polling question here. So the poll that we'd like to hear from you on this time is how have you reevaluated your pension plan risks within the last year? And we've given you 4 options: either yes you have, no you haven't, we sort of have, or no, we've actually never ever looked at this. Let those responses continue to trickle in here for a few more seconds. So based on what we're seeing here, I think there's some work to do for many of you that are listening in on today's call and really assessing your current risk profile, understanding just how volatile that funded status could be over different economic conditions, and really coming to understand whether or not as an organization you're comfortable bearing some of those more tailed risks, right? Similar to what we saw, especially in March. For those of you that have evaluated your risk standpoint within the last year, it's worth looking at again to make sure that the way that you are mitigating that risk or trying to control that risk is still in alignment with where your plan sits today and what your goals and objectives are going into the future. All right, we'll move on from this. I'm going to actually turn it over to Joe now to talk through the next several items, but starting with administration. So Joe?
Yep, thanks, Michael. So yeah, the next few items we have are all falling under pension administration. And as we'll see as we go through the slides, we're going to be talking through administration systems and processes. We're going to take a look at recent legislative updates and how those might impact your pension administration. And then I'll wrap up this section with every actuary's favorite topic, data. But let's move on, and we'll start with administration systems. And when we think about what systems plan sponsors use to administer their plans, we usually kind of categorize them into three different buckets, right? So the first one we've called DIY, do it yourself, right? This is the Bob Vila approach to pension administrations, where the plan sponsor really takes on responsibility for all aspects of managing the plan administration. So that's maintaining participant data, performing all benefit calculations, the production and mailing of forms and statements, also required notices. Certainly anybody who had to just send out an annual funding notice this week, those are going to be top of mind. All participant interactions, so that's phone calls or any other mailings or inquiries, and coordination with the trustee as well. So anytime you have somebody looking to retire, the plan sponsor themselves would own, instructing the trustee to start making benefit payments. And when we look at this DIY approach, there's some sponsors that are still very manual in their approach. So they have their Excel spreadsheets that they built, maybe as long as 20, 25 years ago, that they just keep on updating. The plan formula hasn't changed much, and so they're able to still use those spreadsheets to calculate benefits, and then they take the results of that, and maybe they just print out the Excel spreadsheet and attach it to the benefit election package that they have in a Word document that they fill out themselves anytime somebody comes to retire. But there have been some pretty strong advances in administration software solutions, so that even when a plan sponsor is doing all the work in-house, we see more and more sponsors are looking to use these specialized software options so that a lot of these processes are much more automated, so that they basically can look up the record, click a few buttons, and then obviously do a double check to make sure everything generates properly before putting in the mail, but able to streamline the process for themselves. The next bucket is on the other end of the spectrum, the fully outsourced solution, where plan sponsors are hiring a third party to basically do everything I just said. So all that, maintaining the data, the calculations, participant interactions, usually through a call center. Sometimes they'll have a web portal that participants can use. That's all being done by a third party, and obviously there's a cost to that, but it relieves a lot of the hassle and the headache that the DIY solution can cause. One thing we always say it's important to keep in mind is that usually those third party providers are providing ministerial services, but they are not taking on ownership or fiduciary responsibility, that the ultimate responsibility still lies with the plan sponsor. For ERISA governed plans, there's specifically a term in ERISA called a 316 plan administrator. You might have heard the capital P, capital A there. That is a fiduciary role, and unless the third party has explicitly said that they are taking on that role, that responsibility, that fiduciary responsibility, still lies with the plan sponsor. So far too often we hear about whether it's clients of ours or others who thought that they had fully outsourced their plan administration and therefore were no longer the plan administrator, only to find out when something comes up, a question comes up, that their third-party provider says, well, I don't know. What do you want to do? I'm just doing ministerial tasks. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then finally, the third bucket is a hybrid or co-source solution where it's a mix and match of the first two. And I say somewhere along the spectrum, but actually it's really multidimensional spectrums where it's not just you outsource a little or outsource a lot. It really can depend on what the sponsor themselves thinks that they're good at and what they want control over and what they want to own versus what parts can cause the most headaches. So, we see a lot of clients that we work with will hire us to help with the benefit calculations, let the actuaries do the math, but still want to own all participant interactions. So they take the phone calls, they answer questions, they do all the mailings. Other clients are almost at the opposite end where they feel like they can do all the benefit calculations. They want to own that part, but they really would rather somebody else, handle the day-to-day questions. So they'll hire a call center just to focus on that aspect of pension administration. So there are quite a few options out there that really can run the gamut. But when we're looking at the current pandemic situation and the crisis that we find ourselves in, and in particular as we begin to come out, we think there are going to be some key questions no matter what system you use. And really they can be summed up with that first bullet there. How did your setup work during the crisis? Right? So if you are one of those DIY sponsors that's doing everything yourself, were you able to keep those processes going if you were working from home, if you didn't have access to all the same data or maybe even the same software, the phone lines, the mail? How did that work? Conversely, if you're fully outsourced, take a hard look at how your provider managed the crisis. Were they able to keep up to their response times that they committed to when participants call in with questions? Were they able to access, all their mailing capabilities? Did they have appropriate workarounds? What were their business continuity plans like? No matter what service you use, whether you're doing everything yourself or you're outsourcing some or all of it, there's a key time as we come out of this crisis that you need to take a hard look at how everything worked, where the gaps were, and what can be done to improve. So on the next slide, we have administrative procedures, and this can go hand in hand with the systems you use. But when the procedures we're talking about are more, not just the tools you use to get the work done, but how you actually go about getting your administration done. And again, there's really a key question that you want to look at as you go through and then begin to come out of the current crisis. Are your processes robust and are they flexible? And those two things can mean similar things. But when we say robust, one example is, do you have a well-documented administrator's procedures manual, something we recommend for a lot of our clients, that they have a documented process that they use to administer the plan? Or do you have the person that I call Kim? It just so happens that a number of my clients have had somebody who's, oh yeah, Kim, she knows everything about our pension plan. She's the person, good old Kim. She knows the answers to all the questions. I've met a few Kims myself. They're fantastic. But it seems like more and more of them are retiring these days as DB knowledge becomes more and more specialized. And, if you have Kim retire right in the middle of a crisis, are you going to be able to keep administering your plan? Or are you going to be begging and pleading with Kim to just give you a few more months? So that's the kind of robustness we look at. And when it comes to flexibility, I think this is a great example of how these procedures need to be flexible because, many of us are working from home now. Are we able to do the work that we have committed to our participants to do when we are at home? And we have a bullet here saying plans have to be administered in accordance with their terms and with ERISA in the case of ERISA governed plans or the appropriate state or local laws. But a lot of times, whether it's those plan terms themselves or even within ERISA, there are requirements on when you're supposed to be getting back to participants, when you're supposed to resolve claims, how long participants have to review their own options, and you need to have flexibility with how you respond to such participant questions. I have one example of a client of mine who currently, they're committed to getting to responding to 2 weeks, responding to their participants who apply for retirement within 2 weeks. That's their documented procedure. Well, right now they're working from home and they don't have access to a lot of their files. So it turns out I just heard from this client that they're basically sending out benefit applications that they know are inaccurate, but they think they're good estimates, and that's how they're approaching this period. Is that they're being very upfront with the participants, saying, if you want to retire in the next few months, you can retire on an estimated basis, and then once we get back to the new normal, we can true up this calculation. But that's how they're implementing their flexibility. Obviously, you have to find the right solution for you, but again, it's important to make sure that you're able to be nimble when these kind of situations come up. A few common topics when it comes to administrative procedures that you might be having particular difficulty with right now. First is post-normal retirement, right? So for active employees who are working past normal retirement age, are you suspending benefits for them, or are you going to continue to apply actuarial increases once they reach and surpass normal retirement age? And if you normally suspend benefits, are you still able to send out those suspension of benefit notices that are required under ERISA? Again, given the current situation that we find ourselves in. For vested terminated participants, a lot of times plan documents or documented procedures require that former employees who reach normal retirement age are supposed to commence. You're not supposed to be able to allow them to delay their retirement. Are you able to find those people? Are they able to get the paperwork into you in time? So these are all questions that you're going to want to look at and address and see if there's ways that you can close those gaps as we come out of the crisis. And finally, a few notes on commencement timing as well, things to keep in mind. There are rules around when the annuity starting date can be and the differences between what that annuity starting date is and when benefits actually begin to get paid. There's some flexibility in there, but it's important to keep an eye on that. Election periods generally have to be between 90 and 180 days. If you sent out a retirement application in February before the crisis really began in full force, and somebody sends that back to start a commencement in May or June, if that's going to be waiting for you on your desk when you finally get back into the office, you have to make sure that it's still within that valid election period, because there are requirements around that, and at some point that election becomes no longer valid. And finally, required minimum distributions. So again, anybody working under ERISA where people who turned 70 and a half in 2019 were required to commence on April 1st. We're now 29 days past April 1st. Hopefully those commencements were able to happen, or if not, what is your process for getting those started retroactively as soon as possible? There was relief in one of the recent laws that I'll be talking about in just a second for required minimum distributions from defined contribution plans, but that relief does not apply to defined benefit plans. Anybody who had a required beginning date of April 1st, 2020 from their DB plan, that still applies, so something important to keep in mind. So looking ahead to the next slide, then, we have legislative updates. So we talked about systems and processes, and now we have to talk about, what happens when things change, right? And in particular, just in the last few months, we've seen two fairly significant legislative events on the retirement front. One was a multi-year effort at a pension reform and retirement plan reform law that many called the biggest change in retirement legislation since the Pension Protection Act back in 2006. That was the Secure Act that passed just at the end of 2019. And then just a few months later, there was another fairly significant change in retirement law. This was in the CARES Act. That was part of that was the big, coronavirus stimulus and relief bill that passed. That included things like that Paycheck Protection Program and some, other stimulus and relief functions. But included in there was also some retirement legislation. So between those two things, there's some key provisions for defined benefit plans, and I'll run through these quickly to make sure you're aware. That includes contribution timing relief, so any DB plan contributions for corporate plans that were due this year have now been delayed to January 1st, 2021. Changes to require minimum distribution dates. So again, I mentioned for DC plans that RMDs are not required this year. But also looking forward, I mentioned the 70.5 rule for anybody who turned 70.5 in 2019, but starting in 2020, the 72 was the new 70.5. So now anybody who turns 70.5 this year, it no longer has a required minimum distribution for next year. That's now age 72. There's significant relief for early distribution and plan loans. That's both relief on the excise tax for early distributions, as well as flexibility around rollover timing or when you recognize a distribution in income. There was non-discrimination testing relief for closed plans, as well as ACT relief, again, for risk-of-governed plans that are subject to benefit restrictions. And finally, this one is actually not a specific retirement plan specific provision, this compensation for new leave definitions. This arose because one of the other pandemic relief bills implemented mandatory paid sick leave for small employers. And for many employers, we had this come up on a couple of our clients where this was not something they provided previously, and they didn't know how to treat it when it came to pension compensation. Is this something that they should be allowing people to defer on their 401k? Do they provide a match for it? So these are important questions to ask. Again, not even coming from a specific retirement plan provision, but some of those knock-on effects that you can see as there's just so many law changes happening so quickly in this environment. And so as we look at these things, it's important for sponsors to understand they have some decisions to make, both that are purely strategic, for example, whether or not to take advantage of those contribution deadline delays. It's arguments on both if you're facing some cash constraints. Obviously, it's great to be able to have some flexibility on timing there, but at the same time, and Michael's going to talk a little bit about this later, but we're seeing a lot of liquidity concerns within retirement plans, and also there is an interest penalty for any contributions that are delayed, so important to think through those. And then other things like whether or not to allow loans in your plans where you have not done so before, or to let your participants take advantage of those early distribution taxation relief that was provided. It's important to note some of these might be mandatory changes, like the requirement of distribution dates, whereas some are optional. And make sure that you're keeping your plan documents up to date and compliant, and also that you're administering the plan even before you update your plan documents, administering the plan consistently and in compliance with the new laws. And finally, one thing I'll mention, we had a client of ours that told us that they saw this, and I did see this, on some of the bulletin boards as well, that there are some providers that when these laws came out, they just assumed that all of their clients would want to adopt them, and they just automatically updated their platform so that, for example, the loan limit that would normally be a limit of $50,000 from a retirement plan, you had the option to update that to $100,000, and this provider just went ahead and did that for all of their clients, all the plans on their platform, without actually confirming that that's what sponsors wanted to do. So, check in with your providers on these new provisions. Make sure that they are following your direction and that decisions aren't being made on your behalf. So finally, as I said, every actuary's favorite topic, right? Data. So, it's a key thing to look at any point in time, and this is something we're always encouraging our clients to look at, is how you maintain your plan participant data. But I think that, this current crisis really highlights this issue as being just absolutely critical. Are you using an electronic database, or do you have hard copy files, maybe some combination thereof, where you have the valuation data and some of the more basic data electronically, but then when somebody actually retires, you have to go and refresh, get their paper file to make sure you have all the right information in front of you. Why is this important? Well, again, these reasons kind of always apply, but I think most importantly we can see is you might not always have access to those hard copies, especially if they are off-site. We see our clients that have to either go down to the file room 3 floors down, or even pull in boxes for people who might have terminated a long time ago, pull it in from off-site storage. We're hearing from our clients, and I already shared with one of mine that's, when we talked about flexibility, they're not able to access those files right now. And so, they still need to make sure participants are able to get their benefits, and how they approach those issues can be pretty difficult. So to the extent possible, obviously, an electronic database that has all the information you'll need to administer the plan, it obviously would be ideal. Certainly we're aware that those can be difficult to get updated and maintain, and there certainly could be a cost in doing that, but we do strongly encourage them. Even outside of a crisis scenario, we have listed here some reasons, talked about when somebody actually retires, but also a common issue we see is, once a retiree passes away, what, if anything, is payable to their beneficiary? A lot of times, you'll have the retiree's information. It'll all be there, very well documented. But then, maybe somebody's been retired 20, 25, 30 years. They pass away, and then their spouse is saying, all right, well, where's my benefit? They just assume they're going to keep getting the same amount. But in fact, if you don't have an electronic copy of what they were supposed to get paid, you might have to go back to their actual retirement, handwritten application 25, 30 years ago in order to find out what they elected and whether or not you have the proper documentation. And another topic near and dear to Michael and myself is de-risking and plan termination exercises. Anytime you're going through one of these, whether it's lump sum windows or doing an annuity purchase, or certainly if you're going through a plan termination, you're going to need data that's really high quality and readily accessible. And if you have that electronically, it just makes things so much easier. It allows you to make decisions more quickly and on a better informed basis. Talk quickly about missing participants, because of course these can be particularly frustrating. Of course, ideally participants would keep you updated every time they move or change addresses, but in the real world we know they don't always do that. The DOL did put out guidance in the Field Assistance Bulletin 2014-01 that provides some, what they expect plan sponsors to do when looking for minimum for missing participants. They have some minimum standards in there, which includes not just sending out certified mail or checking employee records, but also Google and Facebook searches. They actually mentioned internet searches and social media, and that's actually listed as a minimum expected level of effort. And then depending on the circumstance, they recommend what we have there as our second bullet. There's a growing field of search services that come, with a cost that will really go beyond those basic steps and help you find participants. So we encourage you to look into those especially if you're thinking about any of those de-risking exercises that I talked about before. And then finally, any plans covered by PBGC, when you're going through plan termination, PBGC does offer the missing participant program as another option for if you're having trouble locating your participants. So what are the action items that you can take? Again, things that we would always recommend, but especially coming out of this crisis, perfect time. As we emerge, and think about where the gaps were. We strongly recommend all of our clients have accrued benefit calculations on file. And this is especially true if you retain a third-party provider to administer your plan, because so often, the third-party providers will calculate the benefit, and of course they do a great job, but then whether it's, just through their own record keeping or maybe they were acquired, or if you want to go and switch providers, then the new provider isn't the one who calculated the benefit. Too often, it just gets lost, and trying to get these old, historic accrued benefit calculations from these third-party providers, very difficult. But that can also happen if you're doing the do-it-yourself approach, where a benefit might have been calculated, 15 years ago, and it's just been kept on a valuation file ever since, and then somebody goes to retire and they question the benefit calculation, and you have to find that back up. So we strongly recommend you keep good copies of those accrued benefit calculations. Another thing is periodic death audits. This is a service most trustees will provide for retirees, but usually you have to ask, so we do recommend you make sure you're getting those. Missing participant address searches, again, we talked about that. And then finally, make sure you maintain good historical employment records. You can't just have that accrued benefit calculation. You want to make sure you have access to what kind of job the person did, and the extent whether they were hourly or salaried, because that will also come up again when looking at those de-risking exercises. I'm going to talk quickly about plan governance as well, and again, what we see as common issues coming out of this crisis. First one, of course, in this current work from home environment would be meetings. We unfortunately do not get a get out of jail free pass just because we're all suddenly working from home and nobody expected to. It's important that you keep on following your governance policies and maintaining good procedures. This is a fiduciary issue, so whether or not your plan is governed by ERISA, you need to make sure that you're following all your documented procedures and that you are documenting that compliance. You need to follow the investment policy statement, as always, and again, that might be more difficult in this current environment, but you have to make sure you're doing something to make sure, again, if you have a quarterly meeting requirement in there, you're getting together, you're getting on the phone, even if it's just a conference call, or, I think we're all spending a lot more time on video conferences these days, finding a way to make sure you're complying with your requirements and documenting that compliance. And it may be time to revisit the funding policy. A lot of plan sponsors are looking to see if they can get some contribution flexibility right now, and that makes a lot of sense for the sponsors. But make sure that you're still maintaining compliance with your documented policies, and to the extent you need to amend them, do so proactively and not after the fact. So again, for action items, ensure that these meetings continue to take place as required by your policies, and overall. Do a compliance review for those policies, especially as you come out, to see if there were any gaps or if there's anything you can try to amend and retroactively, make yourselves whole before too much time goes by. And no discussion about plan governance would really be complete without talking about plan documents. there's not too much here that really has changed in the current environment. But again, if you're doing a review of your policies and your procedures, including a review of your plan documents, it's a good time to make sure to get the complete look. So very quickly, plan documentation governs the administration of the plan, and this includes not just the plan document, but also all amendments to that document, summary plan description, the summary of material modifications, and board resolutions governing the plan. Speaking briefly about amendments, you want to make sure, especially as we talked about recent legislation, that you're incorporating everything in a timely manner, you're meeting those government deadlines, and in between, before you even adopt those amendments, that you are administering the plan consistently and in a manner that's consistent with legislation and with the ultimate intention of how you're going to amend the plan when you do get around to amending the document. And then speaking about summary plan descriptions, you want to make sure that these are being updated and distributed every 5 years. That is the requirement. It used to be that, for ERISA plans, that there was a 5-year cycle on every time you had to restate the plan document, and so a lot of sponsors were sending out updated SPDs at the same time. Those cycles have gone by the wayside, but the requirement to send out updated SPDs is not. So you've got to make sure you're doing it every 5 years or every 10 years if there was absolutely no changes to the information. You still got to send it out at least once every 10 years. And of course, anytime we're talking about plan documentation, we do recommend that those documents are reviewed by ERISA counsel. And with that, I'll pass it back to Michael to talk about investments.
All right, thanks, Joe. So investments, thinking back to the poll from earlier in today's webinar, this was an item of concern for many of you on today's call, so we'll talk about it for a little bit here. When we think about investments, the first thing that we want to touch on is contributions. So obviously with a decrease in funded status, that will put pressure on contribution requirements for the coming years. For corporate pension plans, especially those that are calendar year plan years, most likely you won't start to see these effects until sometime into 2022 even, and then beyond. And there's a couple of things to consider there that I'll talk about in a minute. But on the corporate pension plan side of things, part of the relief that came through the CARES Act was the option for plan sponsors to defer any required contributions due in 2020 up to as late as January 1st, 2021 with interest, as Joe mentioned. There's some considerations around that as to whether or not you'd want to still make those contributions or not. And that's something that we think you absolutely should be discussing both internally and with your providers. For public pension plans, your future contributions are most likely going to roll on some sort of budgetary cycle, and depending on your contribution policies, whether it's related to an actuarial determined contribution or if it's a negotiated percentage of payroll and the various applicable laws that you're subject to, understanding what those contributions are going to look like in the coming years will also be very important, with the deterioration in funded status especially. To the extent that your contributions are based on some sort of percentage of payroll, if you've got any kind of layoffs or furloughs or things like that you're dealing with, that could obviously have substantial ramifications for the money that's coming into the plan. So we think, as a general rule for any plan sponsor, it's important to understand what your short and medium-term contribution requirements are going to look like. We knew for corporate plans, with the funding relief that's been in effect since back in 2012, that's constrained the interest rates used for minimum funding liabilities, that is set to start, that corridor around those interest rates is going to start to widen here in the coming years. And for our clients, where we've looked at a 5-year contribution projection, they're already starting to see where they might see a spike in contributions in the coming years. The current situation will only make that potentially worse. So understanding what your contribution requirements are going to look like, and then deciding on a contribution policy that actually makes sense for your organization to maybe smooth some of those contributions out, paying a little bit more upfront now, and lowering some of the contribution spikes that you might see in the coming years is something that we think is a good practice for all sponsors to understand. Now, we realize that in situations where you're cash constrained and that's not an option, obviously still understanding how deferring those contributions, delaying them, and how that plays into everything will be important. And that really gets to the next consideration that we've listed here, which is buying low versus selling low to fund benefit payments. For plans that want to capture any potential market recoveries that we'd see in the coming months and years, hopefully, putting money into the plan now will only help you increase and accelerate that funded status improvement as markets recover. For many plans, and Joe alluded to this earlier, there's liquidity constraints, right? So if you're needing to pay out benefit payments and you need to raise cash to do that, many plans are having to look at selling their investments when they may be at lows, which is not ideal, right? It's selling out of the market at the bottom, but you may be forced to do that. Again, that goes back to considering cash that could potentially come into the plan to maybe even be used to just fund benefit payments so that you can keep the rest of your investments intact and benefit from any market recoveries. And then finally, our last point here is really reviewing your investment strategy. This all ties back to that first point that we went through on today's webinar about your goals and objectives and understanding your risks. So reviewing your investment policy now is imperative in our minds. You have to think about the returns that you're needing to generate, how you're generating those returns, how much risk you're potentially taking on. We're seeing some plan sponsors start to explore other avenues for getting protection, downside protection specifically. It used to be viewed that just having a well-diversified portfolio would provide some downside protection, and it does to an extent, but maybe not to the extent that many plan sponsors actually need to see. Because when things start going south with the investment markets, a lot of times what we see is that the market kind of moves together. So where you maybe had low correlations between asset classes, now you have higher correlations between those asset classes, including even alternative investments. So many plans are looking towards a strategy that's been more common over in the UK around using a concept called structured equity to really shape your equity return profile, be able to provide some downside protection that's actually contractually based, as opposed to just being at the mercy of the markets. We talked about liquidity a little bit and thinking about where do you raise cash to make benefit payments. Rebalancing is another thing that you'll want to discuss with your advisors. Many plans have some policy around rebalancing. I think maybe some of the more common ones are on a quarterly basis, some even on a monthly basis. But actually looking for opportunities and working with your advisor to look for opportunities to strategically rebalance, to take advantage of market upswings, we think is in every plan sponsor's best interest. And again, you can see how all these pieces come together and tie together, right? Whatever you're going to decide to do contribution-wise really is going to affect what you do on the investment side and vice versa, right? If you decide that you can't put in more cash or a sufficient level of cash, you may need your investments to work harder for you. And doing that in a smart, controlled way to generate the returns that you need is going to be the discussion you're going to need to have. Conversely, if you've got the cash that you can put into your portfolio, maybe you don't need to take as much risk with the investments that you're in. But it's important to just understand those key points, how they interact, and then again, going back up to the first point we made today, what are your goals and objectives with your plan coming out of this COVID-19 crisis? With that, we'll put up our last polling question for today's webinar. Kelly, if you could put that up there for us. So coming out of today's discussion, which item do you think will be of highest priority for your organization? We'll give you a moment here to respond. And notice we didn't put an option in there for none. We think everybody's got something to address. And based on these results, thinking about the investment strategies, how to deal with current markets, how to improve funded status. Those will be some key areas. And hopefully you've come away today with some good thoughts on those. And if you've got further questions on that, we can absolutely address those. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joe to go through, in the last couple of minutes here, our bonus discussion for today.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. We do have just a few minutes, and we want to make sure we address any questions that are out there. But we did want to just speak briefly about a topic that, again, probably near and dear to most actuaries' hearts, which is, thinking philosophical for a second about why you even have a retirement program, right? So very often, the answer we get at first is, well, everyone else has one, and we want to make sure we're competitive, right? And that's a good answer if that's the reason. In order to make sure you're able to attract employees, you need to have a market competitive plan. But often when we start to get into discussions with our clients, maybe a second order question would be like, oh yeah, I want to make sure people are able to retire, at the right time. I don't want people working until they're, in their 70s or 80s unnecessarily. And I want to make sure I'm encouraging people to stick around. I want to reward long service employees. And these end up being really delving into the more workforce management issues that we think a proper retirement program design should really get into. And so I would ask, what kind of employee profile you're looking to have, right? Why do you have employees that are coming in, working for a few years and going out? Is that what you're looking to achieve, or maybe do you need to do more to incentivize them to stick around? Are you looking for that kind of career-long employee that has, works for you for 20, 30, 40 years and then is able to retire in, late 50s or early 60s? What kind of profile are you looking for? Because, when you answer that, how you answer that question should really have a big say on what kind of retirement program you have. Especially, if you're looking for that second kind of employee that's going to, spend a good long career with you and then retire at the appropriate time. A defined benefit plan can really be powerful for providing the right incentive to stay for a long time. It rewards longer service. And then, in particular, make sure that employees can retire at the time you want them to. It's a fact of life that older employees tend to come with some higher costs, whether that's healthcare costs or workman's comp or other issues like that. Some older employees, as cognitive decline begins to set in, they're just not as efficient or effective. Certainly not true about everyone, but is the case with some employees. And overall, it's important that employers are able to manage their workforce effectively. I'll say my parents have been planning for a long time to retire this summer. My parents both in their late 60s now and made a decision several years ago that they were going to retire the summer of 2020. Of course, that was before the current economic environment set in, but they both have strong DB plans, and so they're not really too worried about. They certainly have some investments, but they don't have to tap those for a while because they have those strong defined benefit plans available to them. We see with a lot of DC plans, especially where employees are left to kind of invest in their own way and they end up taking too much risk as they approach retirement. Retirement plans are often delayed by a few years when we have an economy like we do right now. And that's exactly the time when you don't want to be, retaining employees. Employers are often looking to maybe reduce their headcount in a time like this. Those people who are voluntarily retiring can be a godsend in those situations. So if your employees are not able to retire in an economy like we have today, that can end up really causing a problem. So, something to think about as you're going through taking our 10 action items that we've encouraged you to take. Maybe you'll take a bonus 11th action item and really think through, why you even have a retirement program and whether or not the program you have now is achieving your goals. And with that, I think we've just got another minute or two left, so I think I want to move on to a summary and see if we can just address one or two questions here at the end. So just to reiterate what Michael said at the start, we really wanted to give you some concrete action items to make sure you're well positioned to manage your pension plan as we emerge from this crisis. And that comes from investment risk and other kinds of risk facing your plan, as well as your contribution strategy, making sure you're staying on top of plan administration and that your systems and processes are robust and flexible, and make sure that you're adhering to good governance even during the crisis, and not exposing yourself to any of those plaintiffs' attorneys who are just going to be chomping at the bit, ready to strike once we move out of this crisis. And with that, I think we probably just have time for one question. And Michael, maybe I'll let you start off with this one. But I'm seeing here any more legislative discussions concerning further relief to minimum funding requirements for DB plans?
Yeah, no, happy to address that, Joe. While we haven't seen anything, even in these follow-up stimulus bills that have gone through Congress related to corporate defined benefit plans, we still have seen some rumblings around further relief that might be on the horizon. And I think as the dust starts to settle, as we have a clearer picture on how we come out of this pandemic and what the long-term effects are going to be, I think that will give Congress some reason to act. Now, where we expect to see some of that action take place based on even other proposals that were out there before the CARES Act would be around that interest rate corridor for determining minimum funding liabilities for corporate plans, both shrinking that corridor and extending it even longer. That would potentially give plan sponsors some contribution relief. Akin to that would also be something on the PBGC side of things. We haven't seen anything yet. In fact, no real monetary relief for corporate pension plans, but it's not unfathomable that we'll see something in the coming months, especially as we get back to work and start to hopefully get back to business as usual. And depending on what the picture looks like for many companies, that will greatly influence what Congress I think will have on their agenda and their radar. Hard to tell, though, too, being an election year, but I think this current crisis has shown that Congress has to take action regardless because there's a lot at stake. So with that, I don't see any other questions. And given that we're at the top of the hour here, we want to thank everyone again for taking the time to be on this webinar with us today. We hope you've gained some new insights and have a couple of things that you can go back to your teams with to address. And to the extent that there's any further questions, Joe and I are happy to field those offline at your convenience. So with that, Kelly, we'll turn it back to you. And again, thanks to you and the UCS staff for
great presentation.
Putting on this webinar today.
Excellent information. I think everyone really appreciated it. If you wouldn't mind filling out the evaluation, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to pop up at the end of your screen. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon and stay safe and healthy. Thanks again, Michael and Joe.